Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Parenting Pickup, a podcast simply made to help families with trending topics and so much more. We are positive you will pick up tidbits of helpful tips, tricks, activities, and advice when listening to our podcast. I'm your host, Kara. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in another episode of Parenting Pickup. We're excited to have Kate Wessinger here with us, and she is the New Horizon Academy mental health specialist on our podcast to touch on the topic of grief. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you.
This topic is most definitely not talked about enough, and it can even be awkward to talk about, but we have to discuss it. So we're really elated to have you here to talk about this important topic to help families.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
So I'm just going to kick it off by asking, can children experience grief?
Absolutely. So all children of all ages can experience a range of experiences that lead to grief, right? So a lot of people are familiar with divorce or moving homes. And of course, death comes up most often when people think about grieving. And that also includes babies. I think people forget about babies sometimes, or they think that they're so little that they don't know what's going on, but they also experience feelings of loss and distress. I have an interesting example that comes up actually. I know we think about some of the really hard things that people go through that are obviously grieving, but kids can grieve all sorts of simple little things too. So kids grieving their caregivers at drop-off could be something that people experience and are familiar with. But a couple months ago, my daughter, who was a toddler, she still is at the time, we got a new car. And that was a really clear grieving experience that she went through that none of us expected, because it's kind of a happy thing, you get a new car. It was exciting for her family, and we had to help her grieve mommy's old sedan, which we were happy to let go, but she needed more time with that. And it went from refusing to get in the new SUV to a couple days later coming down to the car and going, "Mommy's car is gone." And then, was able to get to the point of saying, "Yeah, mom's car's gone. This is the new car," and went through that whole process. But it took a couple weeks.
Sure. And I guess I maybe not have thought of that as grief. Like I have my own story. My son, we had a tree in our backyard and it needed to be cut down because it was diseased and not safe and could have fallen on the house, which would be unsafe for everyone. So the right decision was to cut it down. But he was so sad about it and would talk about how all the things he did with the tree, climbed the tree, read by the tree, and was so sad. And we had to save like a chunk of the tree, and he kept it in his bedroom, and he just missed that tree. And I guess I didn't label it as grief. I just thought, oh, this is an attachment. But now that you mentioned the story about your daughter, that definitely was grief. And I didn't think about someone having grief regarding a tree.
Yeah, events, objects. Technically, a tree is living, so that might be a lot of empathy on your son's part. But yeah, otherwise, all of those activities he did around it, it sounds like he ended up losing and was grieving over. Absolutely, I would agree with you.
Right.
Aww.
Right. It was really hard.
Absolutely. It makes total sense.
Yes. So it's so important we're talking about this,
yes.
which is great.
Children grieve. It's important to talk about.
Most definitely, but kind of hard to talk about. We all know death is part of life, but how do we even begin to explain it to children?
Well, it's good that we're thinking about it and trying to be thoughtful, frankly. I think a good place for a lot of folks to start would be to simply just ask their child what they know about death, or if it's a specific death that you all are going through, to ask about that particular death. And really their answer should give you a place to start. Some kids are going to just relate it to, it's going to depend developmentally, right? They might relate it to, oh yeah, well, I saw a dead ant. Like, I know what death is. I saw a dead ant. And it's, oh, okay, well, then that kind of gives you information that, oh, well, they're aware that living things die. And then that might give you more information about like, now I really got to help paint this picture for them so that they understand this one. Or you might have another child who goes, yeah, we put flowers at my grandma's gravesite in the cemetery. So that child understands more, right? You also might have children who say something that isn't quite right, or factual, I should say. So a child that might say something like, my uncle died because he drank beer. They're probably talking about somebody who died from alcoholism or alcohol poisoning, and so their understanding or the way they describe that kind of can show us where can we fill in some of those gaps in their understanding in an age-appropriate way so that they can go through a grieving process and also understand some of the things that are going to be helpful for them about death so that they know what to expect and have a healthy concept so that they can grieve through that process.
Sure. So then how do children understand death?
Well, there are really 4 facts that children need to learn in the process of whatever death experience that they go through. You know, a lot of people grieve maybe grandparents, pets, you know, that example of maybe the tree, something, you know, the car in my family. So it could be some simple things. But when we think about death and even people who have gone through traumatic experiences in children, there's really 4 facts that need to be understood at the child's developmental level. So the first fact is that death is due to physical reasons. So like the heart no longer beating or the lungs no longer breathing. Not because you didn't say goodbye to them when you were mad. Not because you think you did or did not do something, right? Because children can come up with what are called mistaken beliefs, or take things personally, right? When they don't have this fact in place and explained properly to them. So that's the first one. Death is due to physical reasons. The second one is that all functions, so pain or breathing or hunger or thirst or feeling cold or heat, all of our feelings and sensations, they all end at the time of death. And this is really important fact for kids to understand because we want them to feel secure and not worry about what the dead person may be experiencing wherever they're physically located. So sometimes that might show up as a child who thinks that a person who is dead and they know is in a cemetery might be feeling lonely or cramped, and that just isn't true, right? And then that would cause the child to have a lot of distress over that, understandably, if they thought that the person could still feel something like that, and they can't. So that's a really important fact for kids to be able to have knowledge of the living functions that we all have so that they can then have knowledge of those same functions no longer happening once the person is dead. The third important fact for children to be able to understand, and usually the one that most caregivers and parents want to try to shield them from, is that everything alive does eventually die. Usually this is pretty worrisome for parents because we don't want to scare our children, but it's really a helpful fact for kids to understand because it allows us to live in the present moment, to be thankful, to hold dear and treat with safety what we know is precious, and to live life to the fullest because we know that it's finite. It is natural that children will wonder or be concerned about people that they care for when they recognize this fact that all living things come to an end, but we can really support them in our words and actions. And really that can come down to showing and telling them about the steps that we're taking to lead a safe life, or the steps that we're taking to be healthy, especially if they know somebody that died from a certain condition, for us to say, well, we went to the doctor and we made sure that we don't have that condition. So we expect to lead a full and prosperous life for the time being. We don't want to be telling children things that are untruths like, I will always be here for you, which could not be true, and should something happen, that would cause more pain to the child, right?
Sure.
So that is a hard rule for a lot of us as adults, but a very important rule nonetheless to support our children through that they will come to understand that everything that is living does eventually die.
And you're right, that is hard.
It is.
But I think it's that whole transparency that the more factual we can be and honest around it, the greater success a child will have in understanding it and work through the grief.
Absolutely. Right. Otherwise, it can block that grief. And we want them to be able to go through that process because we know that they do feel those same feelings. So very important step. The fourth step or fact is that coming along with all of these is that death is permanent and irreversible, right? So that really can help children when they understand this fact to take away that wondering. Some children who get narratives about paradise or heaven can sometimes fall into a mistaken belief of, well, when are they going to come back from this paradise vacation, or when are they going to come back from heaven? And so we want to be really, again, transparent with kids that the death is permanent and that is something that we can still handle. It is hard, it might be painful, and we can handle that feeling.
That definitely makes a lot of sense. It's kind of the concept of clear is kind, because if we're clear, it treats children with respect and help them navigate that. But with that whole understanding and talking about grief, children have big emotions. So how do you handle the big emotions related to death or losing a loved one?
The pain from loss is really related to two main pieces. So the nature of the relationship, for example, a close relationship for a child is going to be, and for any of us, right, is harder to handle and to cope with than a distant relationship. I remember when my grandma died and my parents were really upset. I wasn't quite so upset. I still cared. I still had feelings. I just wasn't so upset, right? So there's a good example there. And then the other source of a lot of the pain is the nature of the transition, right? So was it an unexpected death? Was it sudden? Was it traumatic in any way, particularly if the child was a part of the event or witnessed any of it? Or was it expected? Did this person have a terminal illness, or were they getting older, or did we know that the dog was going to die, or something like that, right? So it can be harder for children and all of us really to handle those unexpected deaths rather than those expected deaths, because the grieving process is it's so acute, right?
For sure. Talk a little bit about guilt and shame in terms of the grieving process.
These are also normal feelings for children and adults to come up. They usually arise to those mistaken beliefs we talked about, that children, particularly because of their developmental stages, can be egocentric or take things personally, or without those facts that we talked about, can come up with their own stories about, well, this must have been what happened. And so guilt really comes from times when children think that they caused the death because of something they did or didn't do. Like, I said I hated my mommy and then she got in a car accident. That doesn't cause the death, but a child might think something like that, right?
Absolutely.
So that would be where guilt comes from. Shame is similar, but really more about what actions or beliefs maybe the person who is deceased did or did not do to cause their death in the child's mind. And so they might feel shame associated with, well, because my uncle drank beer and I know that that's not good, or my family system suggested that was naughty, or he wasn't to be trusted, or whatever the family's message was around that for the child, they might come up with some shamefulness associated with that. So that feeling might be there, and those shame and guilt feelings are also cause the child's coping, the grief process to be a little bit more difficult if those come up.
That definitely makes sense. And I didn't really think about shaming and kind of guilt as part of that grieving process. But thinking about what you just said and reflecting, I think about my youngest son. He had a pet bird, and he referred to himself as a bird dad and cared for his pet and did all these things. And then when his bird died, he thought it was his fault. He immediately said I wasn't a good bird dad. And so we had to have the whole conversation about all living things die. And I honestly wish I had more of this information that you're sharing, because I think I would have navigated those conversations and the grieving process so much better, because I didn't think that he would have guilt about a bird dying, and he had major guilt and just said, I'm not a good bird dad. He died because of me. And it was really challenging, and I felt like as a parent I lacked all the right words to say at the time. And so I feel like this is a really important topic for families to hear and talk about, and hear about it when you're not grieving, so that you are armed with this information, so that you can have the conversation during those most difficult times when you yourself are grieving.
Yeah,
I think that's super important.
I appreciate you bringing that up too, because usually if children are grieving the loss of a loved one, it's probably, attached to somebody that we know and might be grieving too. And we are going to need to hold space for the children that are going through this grief, and holding space for that is harder when we're grieving too, right?
Most definitely. Those are all really excellent points. So are there differences in the type or way that the death has occurred?
Yeah, so like we hinted at, so traumatic or unexpected deaths are harder for adults and children to process and cope with than expected deaths, mostly because and to the degree that the child was also exposed to the traumatic event, like if they were in a car crash and one of the people, the adults in the car also died or something like that, the child has to process the traumatic event first and then the loss second. Whereas if it's just an expected death. I shouldn't say it that way, right? So, and a death that's expected for a variety of reasons, then that is really more of an opportunity for the person just to process the loss, right? There isn't maybe something so traumatic associated with it, and that just usually has it occurring for longer. There's more hard feelings wrapped up in that if it's a traumatic or unexpected death, which makes sense because we can all think about maybe some situation where we suddenly heard that somebody we cared about is now gone, and that brings on certain thoughts or ruminations or questions or bargaining and all of those stages, right, that are just harder and might not have had to go through if we knew that this person was going to pass.
Sure. So in those situations, what should parents say or do when children are experiencing grief?
Well, in general, you do want to talk about your feelings and normalize what you probably are all going through. Again, because usually if children are grieving somebody, we are too as their adults. So, for example, if you've been crying, they can tell, right? Kids are observant. They're paying attention. They can see that, and you can address, mommy feels sad right now. I was thinking about grandma, and I was missing her, so I had a little cry. Do you ever miss grandma? Right? And then you can open up that dialogue. When you're suddenly overcome with a pang of grief or a memory, those are opportunities that rather than, stifling your own healing process at the same time, right, that you can open up in an age-appropriate way to your child as well, and allowing them to connect rather than hide some of that pain and maybe get some false messages about like, well, what's the right way to grieve? Mommy's not showing me that she's upset, so I shouldn't be upset either, where the child actually is upset and would talk about it if they had an opportunity to do so. So we do want to make sure that we're providing some open opportunity for everybody to share how they're feeling, including children.
Right, and what a beautiful way to help children learn about how to talk about their feelings and navigate through those feelings.
Right, those feelings are gonna be right there, and so there's gonna be lots of opportunities to process some feelings. Absolutely.
Yes. So tell me more about how could families approach kind of including the deceased in family activities and memories, or is that just too upsetting?
That's a question that I think a lot of people ask ourselves, right? And sometimes is going to depend a little bit on the age of the child. But in general, even for young children and babies, it's going to be important to keep a beloved part of their loved one dear, I think, through those memories or rituals or celebrations or customs that your family just would normally engage in, and that person who is now gone would normally be included in some way. So it's okay to, especially when they're newly gone, maybe from the events, that they're going to be honored or remembered or memorialized in some way. And even over long term, some families choose to, always have these special cookies at this time of year because this is what grandma always made, right? So there's always some of these little rituals or routines that we get into in a way to honor people. And at first, especially when it does happen, it can be upsetting. I think that that's true for adults. It's definitely sometimes true for kids. And when we allow ourselves to have those moments, maybe we get those special cookies out and they taste so good and then we cry a little bit, but that still helps us process that feeling. And then the next time it doesn't feel quite so painful, right? And then the next time, and then the next time. So every time it helps that person process it. And so maybe at first you can just notice, like, is it too upsetting for your child? And just help honor their pacing a little bit, but I wouldn't shy away from still engaging in some of those memory-making opportunities or rituals, or even having pictures up and things like that. So those are going to be important ways for people to still, be remembered. The child remembers these people whether or not they're physically there anyway. And so having those rituals really live within your family system can allow for some healthy processing.
Right, then that's, I think, the ultimate goal. As parents, we want to help our children learn how to process all these emotions and the grief in a healthy way. And I think, it's a really nice, I think it gives a sigh of relief as parents to think about you can honor the loved ones that have died in making continuing memories and just kind of honoring them with, like your example of cookies. I think that can help a child process and still honor the family member that, is no longer with the family and unable to participate in the traditions and making memories. So, and I think it's helpful to hear that. I think a lot of times we're not certain, and as parents, I think we want to avoid causing additional stress and strain for our children. And so I think there are times we overthink, and sometimes just doing it and talking about it are the best things to do.
The best things, absolutely.
Tell me a little more about how children experience grief. So just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so families can help children through a grieving process in a lot of different ways. We talked a little bit about how children pick up on if it's okay to talk about something or not because they are watching us, right? And they're getting those messages of, well, if I bring this up, is my adult getting too activated by this, so I shouldn't bring it up. So they're picking up on those things. And we want to ensure that children have the opportunity, like we talked about, with at least one trusted adult to freely ask questions, to process their feelings without fear of activating others around them, or, being able to really get some answers, particularly because kids are going to be curious. They're going to ask why. Well, why? How did that happen? Why did I, right? Why couldn't the doctors help grandma? And so they need an opportunity to get those questions answered and those facts answered, like we talked about, to help with that grieving process. A child's recovery and ability to go through the grieving process healthfully is also going to be more difficult without the ability to talk about the traumatic event or without the ability to talk about the death. And for you as the adult to honor the child's pacing, like we talked about, because they have some control over the dose that their systems can handle, and you'll pick up on that. So you might notice that your child asks but doesn't really listen to the answer. And the next time you talk about it, well, they are listening a little bit more. And then the next time you talk about it later, then they're listening, they're actually asking questions about it. So you'll pick up on, if they're making eye contact, if it looks like they're zoning off, if it looks like they're really ready and engaged. And those might change throughout the day or throughout the weeks and months around the death. But we want to make sure that pacing is honored so that it's not too much information too soon, right? So all of us, especially when something hard happens right away, we usually need some time to digest that and to come to terms with that. And that's the same for children too. And another thing that families can really do is to acknowledge, and this might be new information for some people, that children, are going through developmental stages. And they, at every developmental stage, they are going to have a new awareness of the death because they're going to be able to understand it at a new level. And then they're going to have to reprocess that death, maybe reprocess their loss, and probably make some new meaning at every new stage of awareness. And so for kids who have had a death occur in their relationship where maybe it happened when they were like 2, they are going to go through a couple different processes of that, reprocessing of that, when they're 3, when they're 4, when they're 5, when they're 7, when they're 12. It's going to feel a little bit different at each one of those developmental stages, and adults really need to be prepared for that, because when the child keeps asking or is reprocessing, sometimes adults are like, well, aren't they just going to get over it? And we want people to realize that they are starting to get over it, but they are also still going to go through this as a normal developmental process because they have new learning that they've done, right? They have new awareness that they're going through at each developmental stage. And so people really need to be prepared for that because it can feel like a lot of work sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think that's something personally I haven't really thought about how at each stage of development there would be new questions, a deeper understanding. It's not a one and done scenario.
Right. It usually isn't. As long, assuming that the child has a trusted person that they can go to ask those questions, you will see the child reprocess it when they reach new stages. Yeah.
And kind of the next things that come to mind is, I bet I know what you're going to say, when people wonder if children are too young to understand, or will they just get over it?
Right. So there's no correct or right or wrong way to grieve. Processing loss takes time. And there are, though, these symptoms that might be interfering with daily life if those occur, or if the grieving process is taking longer than 6 months, those are not normal. And those are going to be things that people are going to want to get some extra support for. But that processing and reprocessing, that is normal, like we just said, and also participating in mourning activities or exploring through play, doing drawings. You will also see this come up for kids who might have extra empathetic responses to characters or, death that they encounter even out on the playground or something. Again, often it's with animals, where they might be worried, like, well, who's going to take care of the baby squirrel now that the mommy squirrel got run over by the car, right? They might really have some activated feelings about that because they have been more in touch with death, right? They have more of a context for it, and it's going to be coming up as they process it through all of those avenues because that's what kids do, right? They process things through play. They're going to pick up on these things in their daily life too. And so we want to make sure that kids are not going to just get over it. They need all of the things that we've been talking about so far. And it's also good to know when they might need a little bit of help too.
Sure. And I'm sure the reprocessing happens developmentally. And then if they have a friend that it has their grandma died, and then that may bring up their own feelings about their own grandma dying.
Yeah. And depending on where they are, they could be a real asset to that peer and say, well, yeah, my grandma died. I know how hard that can be. Do you want to talk about it? Some kids will have some of those empathetic skills, even by the time they're in elementary school. So
Right. right? I think there's lots of opportunities for them to reprocess that, which I think is new for us as parents, because you think, oh, well, we talked about it and that happened a year ago. Now we're talking about it again, or it's 3 years later. And as parents, we should just expect that there could be multiple things that happen that cause it to just come up again, and that we need to be that relied upon adult that can talk through their feelings and support them.
And it might come up at odd times too, because it's usually kind of a little bit of a joke about like what kids end up talking about in the car rides, right? Because their minds are just kind of able to wander, and they might go, whatever happened to that dog Lucy we used to have? And they're just gonna and it's gonna just come out of nowhere to you, maybe.
Right.
And for us to just be ready to, okay, well, here's another opportunity to talk about this, and they're processing this again, they're thinking about it, and we want to be there for them.
Most definitely. How does religion come in?
Yeah, great question. So mourning is the cultural actions that we go through, the beliefs, the practices for the living that are associated with acknowledging someone's death. And then grief is the psychological or emotional kind of relational processes of the loss and meaning making. So spirituality, it's important for many people, for people who associate themselves with a specific religion, and even people who are not religious. And usually that spirituality comes along with those mourning activities, so those activities that we go through as a part of the grieving process. So funerals or celebrations of life, what people want, what their last wishes are for how they will be kept or honored. And those really are sources of strength for a lot of people and solace in handling grief. They can be a real coping tool for people. Going through those mourning activities, even for children, is something I would really encourage in a child friendly way, right? And the other thing with religion to think about, other than the strength that it can give people when things are hard like this, is that some of the abstract concepts that accompany many religions can actually be hard for children or complicate their understanding of death and complicate their grieving process, depending on their age and stage. Because we really want to make sure that those 4 facts that we talked about are in place and are understood, and then support them in participating in any beliefs that bring encouragement to them to cope with the loss and make some meaning. So that's where that religious or spiritual part might come in, because otherwise kids can get confused, right? If they're thinking that somebody is in heaven, but they're physically in the graveyard, that can be confusing.
Absolutely.
And so understanding where are the biological facts about understanding death versus what is the spiritual aspect of how we cope with this are kind of 2 different things. So meaning making comes into play here too, because it has been shown to be the most helpful kind of final step in resolving grief for everybody. So for a child, this might be something like, let's say you're looking at photos and the child is saying, well, this is my grandpa. He loved me and he took good care of me, even though we lived far apart and he's not living anymore now. We always snuck chocolates when I went to his house. So there's might be a little story or some meaning, right, that the child's attaching to their early memories and their self-image that's healthy as a part of that. So sometimes some of those religious or spiritual elements come into that for a lot of families.
Sure, that all kind of makes a lot of sense, which is great. And so we know about children will relive things kind of developmentally and may bring them up again. When as a parent should we be concerned about our child and their grief? Is there a point where we should think like, ooh, gosh, this feels like it's somehow off? Is there a point we should be concerned?
Absolutely. So some of the normal signs to look out for are let's just go through, there could be a range of things, right? Because we all go through this a little bit differently, but it could be lethargy or appetite or sleeping changes. Younger kids might be searching for their loved one because they're kind of physically missing, right? Like, where's mommy? Where's mommy? Where's mommy? There could be sadness, there could be anger, temper outbursts. There might be intrusive thoughts, particularly if the child was exposed to any of the traumatic events. They might have worry or fear associated with what they think they know about the death or why the death happened. They might also engage in some extrasensory experiences, like sensing something associated with the deceased person, and this could be as simple as thinking they hear their parent's voice when the parent really isn't there, right? So that can happen for children too. Sometimes they can get preoccupied with the event or the loss. They might even be really unable to hear or see any reminders of the event or the deceased person, and those would be all signs of, some things that might happen, but also signs if something was hard for them that would be coming up there. So you can expect normal grieving to occur over about 6 months.
Okay.
And if any of those symptoms really interfere with daily life or are lasting longer than 6 months, then we would want people to seek professional psychotherapy and counseling. So that the person can get support for going through more of a healthy grieving process. And not, it sounds like maybe it would be getting stuck if something was happening, like if the person was perseverating or continuing to worry or really being fearful about something related to the death that they've experienced.
Right, that they just need some extra support. Yeah, that's helpful. Are there things that we as parents can do to help our children?
Right. So continuing with that open conversation and that memory making that we talked a little bit about. I love your example that you just went with it with your son and gave him a piece of that tree. Like just if that was useful to them. Might sound silly to you, but okay, if this is useful to you, let's go for it. So people will think of unique ways to do those things in their families, and that's important that it's special to the relationship or the child and what's meaningful for them. Parents can also, in addition to following the guidance on grief, like what we're talking about, play therapy or various types of counseling for adolescents is always recommended for children who have experienced a traumatic or close loss, even if it's expected. So especially, if sometimes it could even be like mom is sick, mom has cancer, and we all kind of know it might be terminal. Right? Or we're trying to help prepare the child for that. That'd be a great time to get them into counseling before it happens, right? So they can have that support already there to handle it as it's happening.
Sure, because the other spouse or partner going through it
They're going
is
through it
also
too.
just struggling. So,
Yeah.
Enabling experts just helps with that navigation of grief. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. Do you have other resources that you'd recommend?
So I'd like to share Dr. Bruce Perry's work that he did with Scholastica, which I think you guys can make available, it sounds like.
Yes, we can.
So that people can have a couple of these tips and pointers to go over in addition to listening today.
Great. We will definitely make those available. We're kind of at the point now where we have questions from parents.
Oh, great.
So I'd like to get those in. So a parent reached out, Jen. I told my child that grandma fell asleep and went to heaven to be with grandpa, but now my child is terrified to fall asleep. What should we do?
Well, one of the rules of thumb is to never associate death with sleep for this reason, unfortunately. So I would encourage this family to really redo these conversations from this point on, again, by addressing those 4 facts about death. So maybe it's revisiting it and saying something more like, grandma died at nighttime. She didn't die during the day. She died at night. The cancer made her body so sick that her lungs stopped breathing. If that's, the truth, right? Her body is in the cemetery, and we believe her soul, the spirit part of her, lives on in heaven. She's not coming back, and we miss her so much now that she has died. So something more factual like that hits all 4 of those markers and revisited over and over again with this child are going to be helpful over time. And also probably addressing your mistake is going to be hard work, but it's going to be really important to address the mistake and to address the child's associated feelings. And that could sound something like, you cannot catch cancer. It is safe to sleep. Grandma did not die because she slept, and neither will you. I'm sorry I wasn't more clear at the time that she died. I didn't want to upset you, but I can see now that you are more helped by knowing the facts about what happens when people die. Something like that would be so much more supportive, and really acknowledging the mistake too, so that they can help rewrite their mistaken belief even to realize, well,
Right.
mommy told me wrong the first time, and so now I'm remembering that it's this. And so that child being able to kind of do some self-talk around that is going to be helpful. The other thing I think about with this case would be to encourage the family to make falling asleep and sleeping a positive, more secure experience, since it sounds like it's become stressful. So there might be some, nurturing routines or bedtime rituals that feel good to this child. Maybe that include honoring grandma, but maybe really not, right? That just are about the child having a familiar bedtime routine that feels good to them so that they can fall asleep and stay asleep and not be scared of sleep, because that's a unfortunate one that a lot of people make that mistake.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's really pretty common. I think these are really practical suggestions, Kate, that will help parents that maybe have misspoken in that scenario, again, because they're experiencing their own grief. And so we kind of use things that we've heard growing up.
That might not have been so helpful to us when we go back and think about it too.
Absolutely. And so it kind of gives you that framework of what to say and acknowledge a mistake. I think that's all very, very helpful. Another question comes from Jules, and her question is, we're putting our family dog down soon and want to explain what is happening to our child. What should I do or say?
Well, so this would be one of those examples of an anticipated death. Those are easier in general because there's time to adjust to how and why the loss will happen and what it will mean going forward. So it's still going to be painful, but could make the loss easier to deal with compared to a sudden or unexpected loss. So I would do or say things sooner rather than later and often. And to make sure to address all 4 of those facts about deaths. And so that might sound something like, our family dog's body is so old that it has stopped working properly. We're going to allow our dog to die with us at home, and the vet is going to be here too to give the dog some medicine so it will feel relaxed. We will miss our dog because our dog, when it dies, it's not going to be coming back, and we can cry, and we can also think about all those good times we had with Roxy, right? So just to help that child know even what to expect even before the day comes, to maybe honor, so this is the last time we're going to feed Roxy, this is, the last time she's going to be able to go for a walk, because look, she can't really even walk anymore. And so really helping that child come to terms with things over time will help them adjust rather than having it be shielded from them. And then that would fall into the sudden category, which would actually probably feel way harder for everybody.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. I think time to prepare is incredibly helpful. And just that transparency makes all the difference, and knowing what to expect. I didn't think about that element before, but knowing what to expect, I think in every scenario, as adults, we want to know what to expect. What should I expect in this meeting? What should I expect as I'm traveling somewhere? What should I expect? And children need that as well.
Children need that as well in daily life, but especially for things like this that they probably haven't experienced before and could otherwise is going to feel scary, and they're just going to make up their own assumptions. And those are where those mistaken beliefs come from. And so those are harder to undo, right, than to just give them some of these facts and help them go through that adjustment process and loss as it's happening in this case.
And I think that's the best advice, because as parents, we just want to help them, again, move through the process and support them where they're at and at their own. I really liked your verbiage of kind of pacing. I think that is a nice way to look at it.
And maybe this child isn't going to want to say goodbye to Roxy when it happens, and that's okay, right? So that's an example of like, okay, that's too much for their system. They're letting you know that. But we're going to have a bunch of pictures of Roxy up around the house after this, and they do want that. So it could be a lot of different ways that pacing shows up. And
Sure.
It's just good to watch out for what your child is needing and wanting and when.
Yes, that's excellent advice. Our next question is from Todd, and Todd said, my spouse passed suddenly. Should I take down photos or should I add more? I don't want to upset my child, but I want them to remember their mom.
Yeah, that's so hard. First, I want to say that it's essential for this family to participate in child therapy and probably some individual therapy for the father, because this is sudden, unexpected, it's dramatic. That's normal that people are going to need support for that. Also, this child is always going to remember their mom. right? They're going to remember their mom, in their body, in their mind, in their spirit. So really creating rituals of remembrance and keeping photos up is probably going to be really soothing to you and your child as you adjust to life without mom. It's not like she's gone from your family, right? She's still a part of your family, and was a big part, I'm assuming. And so remembering those little everyday things that mom did are going to be very apparent probably early on with this loss. It's okay to name that. So something like, mom used to read to you before bed, and that was so special to you. It might be different now that I'm going to read to you, but I know we can get through this together. So just honoring even those changes in those routines, honoring her traditions. Again, sometimes this comes up for people at holidays like we talked about. Mom always liked to do this, so would you be willing to do that with me still now? But honoring that where it came from, right? That it was mom, or this is a way we can remember her. And like we said, she's still a part of the family. There might be times when probably this parent and their child want more or less photos up, but simply to be ready to empathize and hold space for that sadness whenever a poignant reminder of mom wells up. Because again, this kiddo's going to remember mom whether there's pictures or not. And if you have the pictures up, it's just going to signal that you're open for your child and willing to embrace how hard this must be.
Right.
And to do that together in a supportive way. It's going to happen regardless. So I'd encourage them to get some professional support and do that in a way that feels supportive to them.
Right. I think that's excellent advice, because it's hard to, again, be in the grieving process and offer the best support possible because you're dealing with your own grief. So I think engaging experts is probably
it's
vital.
Essential. Yeah, vital, essential. Absolutely. That's exactly what they're there for.
Well, Kate, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think
You're
the
welcome.
information will definitely help so much and so many families. And I think personally, I now know how to grieve with better understanding and have tips and suggestions that will help me support my children and myself and family as well when we go through the grieving process. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, and thanks for having me.
Absolutely. If you would like more information on this episode or need access to other resources mentioned, head to our website at newhorizonacademy.net. And if you have questions, please email us at parentingpickup@nhacademy.net. Thank you for listening.